The year is 1066. England, a kingdom forged by centuries of conquest, Christian piety, and Viking terror, is facing its greatest identity crisis yet. One dead king, 4 contenders, 3 major battles, and exactly 0 peaceful transitions. King Edward the Confessor had ruled England for over 2 decades. A deeply religious man, he spent more time praying than parenting. Despite being married to Edith of Wessex, daughter of the powerful Earl Godwin, Edward had fathered no children. Some say that was by personal choice, but others say that was by divine impotence. But either way, there was one massive problem for England. There was no heir. And in a medieval monarchy, that's less of a personal quirk and more of a ticking time bomb. England in 1066 was a patchwork of loyalties, powerful earls, Danish descendants, and recent memories of Viking occupation. With Edward's death, that fragile political balance had shattered. So when Edward died in January 1066, he left the throne, a power vacuum, and a kingdom with a very urgent question. Who would rule England now? There are 4 contenders: Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon Earl of Wessex, Duke William of Normandy, King Harald Hardrada of Norway, and the candidate with the best blood claim, the Prince Edgar Atheling. Harold Godwinson's position was strong. England's nobles backed him. The Witan, or the Royal Council, endorsed his kingship, and the coronation happened so quickly that some suspected a power grab. But Harold had deep roots, strong alliances, and military might. His only real issue was a trip to Normandy that happened in his past. Whilst there, according to Norman sources, Harold had sworn a sacred oath on holy relics to support William's claim. Whether he meant it, or was forced to do it, is up for debate, but what was certain was that when William caught wind of Harold Godwinson's coronation, he was absolutely furious. Harold braced for war. From the south? From the north? He couldn't be sure where the invasion would be coming from. The Duke William of Normandy was not an idle duke. He immediately began lobbying Europe's rulers and even the Pope, who granted him a papal banner. That meant that his cause had God's blessing, at least officially. Normandy buzzed with preparation. Shipwrights built a fleet, knights readied themselves, mercenaries were hired from all over France. But the English Channel, wouldn't cooperate. Winds kept his fleet grounded for weeks, and time was slipping away. William needed Harold to be distracted, but conveniently help was on the way, from the north. Harold Hardrada was a legend. Over 6 feet tall, forged in the fires of the eastern wars of Byzantium, and ready to carve out a new empire. He sailed from Norway with hundreds of ships and around 10,000 men. Alongside him was none other than Tostig Godwinson, Harold Godwinson's exiled brother, who was hungry for revenge. Hardrada aimed to take the English throne like a Viking would, through fire and fury. Poor Edgar, he's the last of our claimants. He was only a teenager, but he did have the best bloodline claim to the throne. But at the same time, he had the worst resume. He was not prepared to lead, given that he was still a young child. He wasn't chosen by the Witan, the Royal Council of England. And in the grand scheme of things, he was more of a historical asterisk than a serious contender. By the late summer of 1066, armies were on the move. King Harold Godwinson of England fortified the south, waiting for Duke William to arrive. But news instead came from the north. Harold Hardrada had landed. England's king had to make a brutal choice. Would he stay and defend the south coast, or would he rush north to stop the Vikings? He chose the latter, and he marched fast. Harold Hardrada's fleet swept into the River Humber. He took the city of York's outskirts and demanded hostages. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, rushed to meet him, but they were no match. On September the 20th, at Fulford Gate, just south of York, the Viking hammer fell. The English army was commanded by Edwin and Morcar, and they attempted to block the Norwegians' advance. But the ground was marshy, and the tide was not in their favour. Literally. King Harald Hardrada of Norway's troops, battle-hardened and numerically superior, exploited the terrain masterfully. As the tide turned, the Vikings launched a brutal flanking assault, pressing the English forces back into the rising waters of the river. The slaughter was horrific. Hundreds of English troops were cut down or drowned. Morcar and Edwin barely escaped with their lives. York, now exposed and shaken, surrendered just days later. It seemed Hardrada's campaign would be a resounding success. But just 5 days after the success at the Battle of Fulford, King Harold Godwinson arrived, with an army that had just marched almost 200 miles. It was an astonishing feat of endurance and discipline that Harold had managed to get his army north just within 4 days. Hardrada was caught off guard, because he'd left a portion of his troops and their armour at his ships. Many of his men were relaxing, confident that they had time before any retaliation. The English army launched a surprise assault. King Harold Hardrada was expecting to do a hostage negotiation and trade at Stamford Bridge, but all that he found were the glistening helmets of an Anglo-Saxon army. The early moments of the battle are immortalised by the story of a lone Norse warrior who held the narrow bridge over the Derwent River, cutting down over 40 Englishmen before being killed by a spear from beneath the planks of the river. Once they had crossed the river, Harold Godwinson's army clashed with the Vikings in a vicious hour-long slog. Despite their valour, the Norwegians could not hold, and Hardrada, ever the warrior, charged forward, only to be killed. Tostig fought on and died beside him. Of the vast fleet that Hardrada had brought to England, only 24 ships limped back to Norway. The Viking threat to England had ended in a single bloody day. But only 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Duke William of Normandy finally crossed the Channel and landed at Pevensey. He wasted no time. Motte and Bailey castles were erected. The countryside was pillaged to provoke Harold into a response. Despite the exhaustion among his troops, Harold marched south again. Reinforcements were trickling in, but many of his best men had fallen in the north. Still, Harold positioned himself on Senlac Hill in the south coast of England, ready to make a final stand. October the 14th, 1066. The English and Norman armies faced off from dawn to dusk. Harold's shield wall, tight, disciplined, and nearly unbreakable, was a masterclass in Saxon military tradition. William's forces, composed of archers, infantry, and cavalry, launched wave after wave of assault, but the Normans would not crack the line. Panic began to spread among the Normans, since there were rumours that swirled that the Duke William himself had fallen in battle. But to remoralise his troops, he rode forwards on his horse and removed his helmet, revealing himself to his troops and rallying them. Following this, the Normans tried a new tactic. They began to feign retreats. The Norman cavalry pretended to flee, drawing English soldiers out of formation. And it worked. The shield wall was gradually being thinned out. And when the English had been pulled out of position, the cavalry would turn and counterattack. Arrows began raining down even harder. One legend says that an arrow struck Harold Godwinson in the eye. Whether this was fact or just medieval propaganda, Harold's death broke English resistance. The final English stand was desperate and doomed. As dusk fell, Senlac Hill was quiet, except for the groans of the dying. William had won the day. William advanced towards London. Resistance flickered, but the nobles were exhausted. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. He brought with him a new aristocracy, a new language of power, being Norman French, and a new social order, feudalism. The Doomsday Book, feudalism, castles, taxes, all new, brought here by William. England was never the same again. One king's failure to produce an heir sparked one of the most consequential years in history. The death of Edward the Confessor opened the gates to a storm of ambition, betrayal, and bloodshed, forever altering the course of England's destiny. 4 contenders, each with a claim, a cause, and a crown in sight. 3 invasions from 3 directions, 1 from within and 2 foreign. 2 decisive battles fought within weeks of each other, and only 1 left standing, William the Duke of Normandy. What followed was no mere change of leadership, but it was a transformation of culture, law, language, and identity. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most pivotal moments in English history. If you found this interesting, then don't forget to like, subscribe, drop a comment. Who do you think deserved the throne the most? And until next time.